was, I think, around 85, 86 when I ran into a lead singer from Mortal Sin when I was a young kid. I pretty much ran into him when I was on school sport one day. He went to the opposing high school, saw me in an Iron Maiden shirt, bails me up and tells me about this new band he's starting up that's influenced by Creator and Slayer and all of these bands I just started listening to, but I did find out through a network of friends where they rehearsed. And as a kid, because we couldn't get into the heels in for those shows, we were too young, me and a few friends went up to the rehearsal room, sat outside and listened to them while they practiced. And they were a phenomenal band, they blew me away.
Back in the 80s, there wasn't too many thrash bands around, and I had the privilege of being in a band called Mortal Sin that basically opened up the market for thrash metal in this country, and I'm proud of that. Changed the whole metal scene from the glam metal scene to the thrash metal scene.
Yeah, the Sydney thrash scene, the core of it, the old school of it, kind of started, I guess, with Slaughterlord, Mortal Sin, which led to Addictive and all those kind of bands.
Mortal Sin, just like my bread and butter when it comes to Aussie thrash. They're like a thrash band, thrash metal legends. Yeah.
Sydney is probably home as a pioneer of all styles of heavier music. We're talking AC/DC started like their biggest band on the planet. You know, they're from Sydney. Then you start getting heavy. You got Mortal Sin and Slaughterlord. Both started thrash metal, both around '85. Yeah, the first wave. So Sydney had all the pioneering bands.
To me, they incorporated a lot of what the thrash bands from both Europe and America were doing, and they combined it together, and I still believe that they gave it an Australian vibe.
Yeah, I mean, Mortal Sin were the gods of Australian thrash, let alone Sydney thrash. The reason I started playing in thrash metal bands was to move to Sydney to play with Wayne Campbell, because to me he was a god. He was in Mortal Sin. I got to play in his band, and then we formed a band called Brungeon.
I think it was late '84. I ran into Wayne Campbell, who was in a band that was kind of doing Iron Maiden-y kind of songs. '84 was just when thrash started, and we'd heard the Kill 'Em All album, '83, and a lot of people sort of got excited, and it was like, wow, this is really awesome, this kind of music, double kicks, slap in your face kind of metal. And we said, we want to do this. This is what we want to do, And also it was kind of gravelly kind of singing, so for me it meant I could combine, not necessarily my love of Led Zeppelin, but if you sing like Zeppelin or Queen, you've got to be perfect. And I thought, well, singing thrash, I could get away with it. And then basically early '85, we'd had a band together that we were going to call Mortal Sin. It only took us probably 6 months to get a bunch of songs together. We obviously did some covers. We played Metallica, we did Rite of Violence from Creator, but we'd also had probably 4 or 5 of our own songs. We went from there.
There shall be only one Reaper of the Earth.
Well, I've been in a few bands that sort of weren't going anywhere. I met our first guitarist, Dave, through a band we were in called Fallen Saints. Would have been about 85, 86. So we sort of split off to form our own band. We advertised sort of music press, as he did back then. Got Steve Moore, the drum, and he brought in his school friend, John Kidd. So there was the 4 of us. And then our first vocalist was a guy called Greg Moore. He sang with us on our first EP. Yeah, we used to record at Stage Door Productions. It was a pretty good studio. So a lot of the like touring bands would come through. You'd see the Monkees there. You'd see people like, I think Jermaine Jackson's band.
Rat Cat. I think Stage Door was sort of one of the go-to place for anyone, passing through, whether they were big or small.
Yeah, if they needed a bit of rehearsal before the tour, to get the band happening, they sort of drop in there, I think. At that stage, we weren't really thrashy as such. We sort of had, obviously, we were heavy, but our influence was sort of more, I think, Maiden and Sabbath. When Steve replaced Greg and Rhett replaced John, that was a lot to do with our change in what was influencing us and what we wanted to do, which was thrash. It was, I think, almost like the second generation, a lot of thrash bands that really did it for us. It's not the big four, but the next four, I suppose, Exodus,
there was Violence.
Testament, Violence, Death Angel, that sort of thing. Metal Church, those kind of bands, I think, were more influential in pushing us into a thrash direction, I'd say. But prior to Mortal Sin and Slaughterlord, there were a lot of good heavy rock bands in Sydney. Really good bands, influenced by probably, AC/DC and Priest and bands like that. More so the thrash, because there was this sort of us and them thrash bands and non-thrash bands, I think.
Yeah, well, look, we had to pretty much beg people. In those days, you'd have, like, the venues would have certain promoters that only booked those venues. So, if we wanted to play at the Seven Hills Inn or we wanted to play at the Royal Hotel in Sutherland, you had to go through a certain promoter. So we sent tapes, we sent photos and promos, and no one wanted a bar of it. And I basically went in there and just sort of begged and said, look, we will pull people. I'm telling you this. We showed them tapes from overseas of concerts and things like that, and said this is going to be huge here in Australia. You've got to have faith. You've got to believe in us. Literally was down on my knees just begging, say, please, just give us a chance. If we can't pull a crowd, then don't ever book us again. We won't bother you again. That was the kind of the attitude that we had to get across. And then we finally got a chance. Our first show was at the Royal Hotel in Sutherland back in about February 1986. We played with sort of some non-thrash bands. I think it was Lightning Rock and maybe Lotus or someone. It was something like that. They were all sort of hard rock, heavy metal, sort of in the vein of Van Halen kind of vibe. So when we went down there and played, we had a pretty big crowd there for us, but after us, everyone left. There was probably maybe 50 people left in the room to watch the other bands because everybody wanted to go out and party. The promoter was there to see it all, and she was like, yeah, wow, you guys have got some really good energy, and I can see what you're talking about. And we ended up getting some more gigs after that, and it went from there.
I think they paved the way for most bands like us, I
don't know what would have happened to the thrash scene if there would have been one if Mortal Sin hadn't come along. They were instrumental in pushing it into people's faces, especially, metal people.
The live scene in Sydney in the late 80s, early 90s was incredible. Myself and my colleagues were out virtually every night. You could go and see a band at venues like the Lansdowne. I saw Mortal Sin many times, and they were fantastic. They had a real energy about them, and they were really good players. Matt had a real presence on stage. They were the cream of the crop in Sydney.
I mean, after Mortal Sin started gigging, there were thrash bands popping up all over Sydney. There was Definition, Tyser, Massive Appendage.
Massive Appendage was my favourite band. The riffs were extraordinary. Live, they were chaotic. There was two brothers in the band who disliked each other intensely. Thought they were really funny and really offensive as well. Some of the lyrics you could never write now. I lived with Ox because Ox, of course, was the drummer for them. Shared a house with him, a few other people, and they used to rehearse downstairs sometimes. And you'd hear them practicing and Jed singing, massive clocks gliding through the atmosphere, seeping out the window into the neighbours. And you think, oh my God. The Massive Appendage album cover was painted by Chris Hades. It got banned. It was banned in the respect that if you wanted to buy it, you'd have to go to somewhere like Utopia, and it was under the counter.
It was frozen dopamine. And addictive.
I got to meet the guys from a Sydney band called Addictive, who were, again, a very good band, and the drummer in the band at the time, a guy called Matt Coffey. He was like, probably at that stage, in my opinion, probably the best Australian metal drummer by far. He was so good. He was like, a world-class thrash metal drummer. And I used to go to Sydney and see those guys.
They actually they were from the western suburbs of Sydney. First time I actually heard of them was an interview with Matt from Mortal Sin. And they asked him, who do you see in the metal scene coming up? And he said this band Addictive. They were a great band. They had a demo called Wood 74. They got signed to a small label. They did an album called Pity a Man. And then our drummer actually left us and joined them.
This is our new drummer, Steve.
Slaughterlord, they have that whole Australian sort of power to them, and there's always a thing about Australian bands, it's always just evil and aggressive, and just, like Slaughterlord with the, like I said, the riffing and the vocals and just the whole attitude and pure Australian metal, which is great.
Well, really, we were probably the first completely extreme band in Sydney. We had one around the time of Mortal Sin, but they were nowhere near as extreme as us.
I kind of describe them as, they were a thrash band in the day, but they had elements of pre-death metal. They were more on the extreme level.
We were doing blast beats before blast beats were really a thing. It's quite funny. Blast beats, this guy thinks he's doing blast beats. Well, he didn't invent it, but I came up with it before I heard it. Because I used to listen to Hell Awaits and Bundle by Blood when I was like 45. So I was super fast and super tight. I thought eventually it's going to be like this fast. And then I just started, eventually just do drum beats like this, So let's do it.
They featured, two prominent members were Steve Hughes on drums. He's quite recognised now on his own right, but then it also featured Mick Burke, who is sadly no longer with us. And he is absolutely the pioneer, the grandfather of, I think, thrash metal in the country. He's definitely a pioneering thrash metal guitar player.
They were heavy. And I remember that when I first heard them, I was like, whoa, they blew me away. Like, for a local band, these guys are heavier than everyone else. Funnily enough, they were a local band back then, and that's what I knew them as, just as a Sydney band that I knew played the Hills in and played a few of the local venues. I only found out in recent years that they actually had a cult following in Europe.
There's more people, young metalheads overseas that know. I'd be in Europe doing gigs like you're the guy from Slaughterlord. Yeah, it's fantastic. I was in Norway once in this fantastic shop called Noise Promoted Records. There's a Slaughterlord shirt I've never seen on the wall again. Where'd you get that? Because I made it myself. I went, oh, some drama. Then you must have one. So yeah, it's I don't like out the gates in colour.
I have read in a few articles and that on Slaughterlord over the years that, At the Gates did do a song of theirs, which I think is great tribute that a band like that, of their level, has turned around and paid homage to a little band from Sydney, Australia. I'd go around Seven Hills in the Blacktown area. I'd always, especially in Seven Hills, there'd always be bill posters up for Mortal Sin gigs, Mortal Sin, the Hard-Ons, Because back then, a lot of those bands used to play with some of the punk bands as well, like Mass Appeal and all of that. These bill posters everywhere for Mortal Sin, Slaw Lord, and all these other bands playing, and I noticed that the place would be covered with them. That was when I sort of noticed that, hey, these big guys are doing a fair few gigs.
There was also a few record shops around Sydney. I mean, Matt Mora had a record shop for a while. Utopia was a real meeting point for bands. I'm pretty sure they stocked demos as well.
Utopia was basically, at the time, it was a small little shop in Chalice Arcade that you could literally get anything and everything that was metal. We'd save up our pocket money and we'd go in there to buy the stuff that you couldn't get anywhere else. You'd see the odd guy here and there with a oh, wow, I didn't know you can get a Creator shirt here. How did he get that? And you'd always go up and ask him.
Utopia also was fundamental to the scene. I remember when Metallica came to Australia, there were funny stories of Lars just sort of appearing in there. He'd just sort of rock down and hang out, and fans would be absolutely gasping for air when they saw Lars just wandering around in there.
Talking about, maybe let's record some songs just to hear what we sound like. We'd had 8 songs, so we said let's go in and do a demo. So we went into EMI Studios in Sydney, which at the time was down on Castlereagh Street near Belmont Park. Yeah, we just started recording. We had no idea how to do anything. We just went in there. We got the producer. He said, "This sounds all right, guys. You should just record an album." We're like, "What? What are you talking about?" So anyway, it ended up being Mayhemic Destruction. It ended up being that album. So, we got some money together. We didn't know anything about getting a record label. We didn't know anything about getting management. We just thought, well, let's just go and do all this ourselves. Once we got the pressings, we got ourselves, obviously we used to read a lot of the metal magazines, Metal Forces, Mega Metal Kerrang and a few others. So what you'd do is you'd send a record around to all of them just with a bit of a blurb, who you are, what you do. And one day, I sent one to Shade's record shop, which at the time was the biggest record shop in London. And the guys unwrapped it, put it on, blasted it, and no one's to behold, one of the record executives for Phonogram Records was in there and was asking, was this the new Metallica album? And the guy said, no, this is a band from Australia, Mortal Sin. And they're like, what? I think it was about a couple of weeks later, I got a phone call from this guy, and he's introduced himself. Hi, I'm Dave Thorne from Phonogram Records in London. I said, oh, g'day, how you going? Before we knew it, we were signed to a major record label. For a thrash metal band was like probably an impossible dream.
Mayhemic Destruction! Which I hope you've all got, have you? Let's go into the fire!
They hit a lot of milestones. Like, they were one of the first metal bands in Australia, like a real metal band, not a rock band, a real metal band to release a CD, which back, if you can cast your mind back when everyone was doing demo tapes, the CD was like, wow, they've got a CD out, holy shit.
They're probably one of the first Australian metal bands that actually, at the time, probably got a little bit of recognition. You're seeing them in, I'd say, some of the local heavy metal magazines. What was it called again?
Hot Metal
and things like that. Good fun band to listen to.
Put Australia on the map.
So Mortal Sin, right? Mayhemic Destruction, great classic album, legendary thrash metal album, but it was kind of a bit primitive. Mick Burke, when he left Slaughter Lord, he joined Mortal Sin, and he probably wrote the bulk of Face of Despair. Now that was the album, it elevated the band, songwriting, production, the whole profile just jumped, and a lot of that is to do with Mick Burke and his awesome songwriting. In him and Paul Caruana, they were the best twin guitar attack and songwriters that just mesh so well.
Mortal Sin. Based in Sydney, they have a strong but select following over here. In Europe, though, they've been featured on the covers of all the big metal magazines, and their record company is giving them a huge push.
They threw a lot of money down at us. I think, from memory, it was around $200,000. We had a good budget, so we got a good producer. We got Randy Burns, who had previously done Megadeth and a few other big bands. Yeah, he came over to Australia. We went into EMI Studios again, which was still the same place where we did the first album. and we recorded a whole week of drums, and Randy Burns just goes, I don't like it. I just don't like the room. I don't like the vibe. I don't like anything. So we tore those tapes up and moved over to Paradise Studios. It was in King's Cross, and it was owned by Billy Fields, who was a pretty famous singer back in the day. It was 88 we recorded that, and then the album didn't come out until early 89, just before we did the Metallica shows. Well, look, that Metallica show was realistically the first thrash metal international band that we had. We were supposed to get Anthrax and we were supposed to get Megadeth before that, but for some reason both of them fell through.
Well, the first Metallica was supposed to be here in '86. The Master of Puppets tour. But Cliff Burton got killed in Sweden.
So the Metalheads Metallica was huge thing. I think it was just surprising that they actually would come to Australia. Really, in those days, did see ourselves as a bit of metal backwater, apart from, I think, Maiden. No one else had really come out, and there was no surprise at all that Mortal Sin actually, got that show.
We were lucky that we were label mates. Basically, Phonogram Records had us on their label and they had Metallica on their label. So, when Metallica announced the tour, I was straight on the phone to him and saying, we're getting this, right? But they kind of didn't let it out straight away to us that, yeah, you're on it. I think they teased us. They were saying, the most important thing is getting your album out. Yes, it's going to come out around the same time as the tour. And so, yeah, when they finally said, you're on it, we're just like, oh, man, this is the dream come true. This is just going to be the best thing ever. It's a bit hard to, not to be fanboys, suck up to him or anything. It was just like, hey, man, how you doing? Yep.
And then sort of broken up, like Mick joined Mortal Sin, Mick Burton as a guitarist and sort of, and that the next quarter of that tour was pretty amazing too. Just, so we didn't want to make it off the school, we got next door on stage supporting Metallica, so we live with the stage, but we also these want to make supporting Metallica, and figured out what this was. So we pulled this off.
A lot of guys went to both shows, like they got on buses or drove down to Melbourne the same there as well. A lot of crazy things happened that weekend. But there was even, I don't know why, but the riot police turned up and there were all these headbangers standing around going, oh, what's happening? And these police with their batons and shields, and I don't know, it was weird.
I think heavy metal had a bad name before it got destroyed. Yeah.
Well, it was announced that they were eastern states and Adelaide didn't get a gig. We're the red-headed stepchild of the Australian scene, it seems. So we kicked up a bit of a stink, and we thought, well, let's get a petition going. And we'd already rung promoters, and they were saying, give up, mate, it's not going to happen. We printed up the We Want Justice for Adelaide pieces of paper there, and we had them at the record store, and I was promoting it on the radio on the metal show, and we promoted it for a few weeks, and we had well over 2,000 signatures. They rocked up, we got those signatures together pretty quick, posted it off to the promoter, fingers crossed, and then a couple of days later the gig was announced and they played here, and let me tell you, it went off.
People still talk about those shows. Any metal or any thrash head, if you ask them what's the favourite show they ever went to, I guarantee probably 80% of them will say, oh, Metallica, first Metallica tour.
And that really opened the floodgates for international thrash bands touring. A lot of bands came after that. I think it was a real litmus test for promoters to see how that went, and it was huge. It was manic.
And then after that we had, Anthrax in 1990, and I don't think even Slayer wasn't until a couple of years later as well.
All these other bands that are really seeing Australia as a legitimate destination to tour.
Addictive. They got the Motorhead support in 91. We tried to get on that bill as well, but they only wanted the one band, and They said, "Do you want to roadie for us?" Because we had better equipment than them. So
yeah,
they said, "Do you want to use? We'll use your equipment." And so we just roadied for them at this gig. It was great hanging out with them and overhead at the Haunted Pavilion.
The Metallica tour, that sort of opened up a few more doors for us. So we did a few tours around Australia on our own. And then we did the Metal from the Heart concert at the Enmore Theatre in Sydney. That was a benefit show that we put on for a young kid who was a Mortal Sin fan. He was a cystic fibrosis sufferer.
There was a reader called Damien Heavey, and he was 15 years old. He needed an operation and he needed to go to England. That was the only place he could have it, and he was really unwell. And he was a huge headbanger. He loved Metallica. So we decided to put this concert together, and there was Mortal Sin, I think Mass Appeal were on it. John the Beast emceed it. It was wonderful. It was at the Enmore Theatre. It was a fantastic day. And he went to England with his family to have this treatment, and at the same time as that he did get to see Metallica. He was lifted up in his wheelchair by the crowd, so he did wheelchair surfing, and we had a beautiful photo in the magazine of Damien Heavey with Metallica, which was amazing. James Hetfield was there, and you could see the tears in his eyes. It was a beautiful photo. He was such a happy little guy.
We did that show which had Escape, Addictive, Hard-Ons, Mass Appeal. There was about 12 bands, I think. It was an all-day concert, and we recorded that for a video that we put out later on, Face of Mayhem. We sacked our drummer, and we ended up getting Steve Hughes from Slaughterlord. And then at that stage, we were told that we were looking like we were going to get a couple of shows in Europe. So once that was announced, I think that was announced about September, we were going to be leaving in January 1990 to go and play with Testament.
Which I thought was great because with the work that they'd done, I thought they truly deserved to be playing a venue like that, where they, to a big crowd, because those guys worked hard. I'd always see those posters throughout the 80s when they started out. They were playing constantly. They worked hard. They earned what they got. Hence why I believe that they were successful overseas, because they, in my opinion, for thrash, they put Australia on the map.
Let's do all the cooking and party in the show. I hope you all had a good time. See you later.